More than 2 million children are malnourished in Syria. The government says it'll allow aid agencies to deliver supplies to 3 besieged towns where residents are starving. Will it be enough to meet the needs of the country's young? And who's responsible for their plight? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Too little, too late. That's how the Syrian Emergency Task Force describes aid expected in besieged areas. Towns along Syria's western border have been blockaded for months now as starvation becomes a weapon of war. Mothers say they're feeding their babies salted water because there's no milk. Here in Madaya, hundreds of children are suffering from malnutrition. The medical authority is distributing salt to families with young children. Well, the UN says it can't even get to 2 million children in Syria who need the most help. Now, the government has reportedly agreed to allow humanitarian aid into some of the towns, but it's not clear if the damage is reversible. Let's take a closer look at some of the numbers then. UNICEF says 7.5 million children are affected by 4 years of conflict. And more than half of the refugees who left Syria are under 18. Well, that leaves around 5.5 million children dealing with poverty and war. 2 million of them are no longer attending school regularly, and more than 2 million Syrian children are at risk of malnourishment. Let's bring our guests into the show now. In Damascus, Pavel Krrish, spokesman for the International Committee of the Red Cross. In London, Diana Semaan, Syria campaigner at Amnesty International. And in Berlin, Sebastian Stricker, founder and head of the app Share the Meal. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Pavel, when is the big question here, isn't it, that many people want to know? When will you be able to get aid into some of these besieged towns?
Well, yesterday evening, the ICRC, together with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent and the UN was granted the access to deliver humanitarian aid to the besieged town of Madaya, but also to Fua and Kefraya. Those 3 towns are part of the political agreement reached by the parties. And in fact, this is the agreement, political settlement, that dictates the delivery of aid to these places. Right now, we are preparing the convoy. We are planning to bring food, medicines, but also such essentials that people need for winter, blankets, kitchen stuff, everything that will meet immediate needs of those people inside the winter. Now, one time this food aid distribution, however, it's not the solution to this problem.
It's certainly not. Before you get into the solutions, though, I'm curious to know, when you say we're getting the convoy ready, how much aid are you taking in? In your estimates, this will last these towns for how long?
Well, it's very, right now we are coordinating and discussing the amount of aid that will be brought in. The convoy will be larger, much larger than the convoy that we brought in October. That was the last time the aid was delivered in Zabadani, Madaya, Fua and Kefraya.
Right, but generally, are we talking keeping these towns going for weeks or months?
Of course. Well, this is we plan to meet the let's say at least medium-term needs of the civilian population that are trapped on those towns. But you are making a very, very important point here. One-time food distribution or medical aid distribution, it's not the solution for any of the besieged areas in Syria. We need to be granted an unimpeded regular access to all those places. We need to bring people aid on a regular basis. We have to remember that those people were left without aid for weeks, if not months. That's why it's very important to keep helping them on a regular basis.
Sebastian, as we focus a little bit on the impact on children, they obviously in conflict, and especially under siege, they bear perhaps the most of the burden of these types of situations. Give us an idea of the level of disruption that this causes to children. You know, it's not just starvation, as bad and as horrible that is. It disrupts everything, right? Development, education, and so on.
Absolutely. We can certainly confirm that. Hunger is such a basic need, and if people, and children especially, experience a lack of food, there's desperation that happens, and desperate people do desperate things. And these things we definitely see in Syria itself, but also outside of Syria, where we are active. We are active in Jordan. We see that there as well.
Then a lot of people, you know, watching the pictures which have come out lately, scratching their heads saying, how is this going on in 2016? Is this a war crime?
Exactly, yes. I mean, we've seen, like you were saying, that the sieges in Eastern Ghouta, which has been going on for like 2 years, it's happening again in Madaya. And the Syrian government is using, starvation as a method of warfare, which is a war crime. We've been calling on the Syrian government to not only grant unimpeded access to aid, but also to lift all sieges in compliance with Resolution 2139 and 2165. But so far, they haven't complied with any of the demands of both resolutions.
How easy is it to establish the evidence necessary to pursue accountability in this kind of situation, Diana?
I mean, without a referral to ICC, to the International Criminal Court, we see like any chance of accountability to be very, narrow. But what we've been trying to do is compile this evidence by speaking with witnesses on the ground in the various areas. We've spoken to witnesses in Eastern Ghouta, and we've done so as well in Madaya, who have told us similar accounts of how the government is restricting basic foods and other medical supplies from them for unknown reasons. As you know, like civilians are saying, it's not their fault about what's happening. They need this food to survive.
Diana raises a good point there, doesn't she, Pavel, when she mentioned some of the other areas that have been suffering under siege too, like Eastern Ghouta. What about those other 14 places, I think the UN said, that which are under siege in Syria? Are you receiving any guarantees, Pavel, any indications even that you'll be allowed to take in aid into some of these other areas in Syria?
Well, the ICRC, together with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, did manage occasionally to bring aid to some of those places. Our latest aid delivery in the besieged town of Muadamiyeh is an example of that. We managed to bring some medical assistance. But you are right, it's too little, and it might also be at times too late. That's why we call upon all parties, all involved in the fighting, to grant us this access.
Okay, you've made that call. Just to be clear, what response have you had back from that call when you say you want the regular ability to take aid into needy areas? Do you have any guarantees that what you're doing, or what you're doing this weekend, hopefully will be anything more than a one-off?
Well, I wish the situation would be black and white, but it's not. Syria is an extremely difficult country to deliver aid. It requires constant negotiations, constant push for access, constant consultations. It's not easy. It's not easy, but we keep trying, and we do receive replies. We do manage to cross, but we need to do much more. That's
but right
sure.
Now, as things stand, Pavel, this is a one-off operation that we're talking about, correct?
Well, for now, we have been granted access to deliver aid for one time. We, of course, will be making another request to deliver not only to Madaya, but also to Fua and Kefraya, which I have to remind you makes this operation extremely sensitive, because the aid needs to be synchronized and simultaneously delivered to all three towns controlled by opposite factions simultaneously at the same time.
Right, right. Diana, I mean, we've seen in other parts of the world mass killings, mass abuses of civilians. leading to trials, leading to tribunals in Africa, in the former Yugoslav republics. Why, I guess, is my question, do you not expect, I know you'd wish for it, but it didn't sound like you were very hopeful that we're going to see this for Syria, where, let's face it, there's a lot of kids, not just civilians, but kids being impacted by this horrible tragedy.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, a simple answer would be that as long as Russia and China blocks the UN Security Council from passing the resolution to refer the Syrian crisis to the ICC, we won't see any hope of seeing the people held accountable for the crimes and from the war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed in Syria.
Too much politics getting in the way then?
Exactly. I mean, even we saw like the latest resolution that calls for a peace plan does not include, a specific plan for accountability. It just only mentions the need for ceasefires. It focuses on the ceasefires as a parallel to the political negotiations that are happening. But it's important to point out that ceasefires does not only mean cessation of shelling or hostilities. It should have a human rights component at its heart, which we saw it happening in Madaya, and yet the parties, both the Syrian government and Al-Fatah army besieging Kafraya and Al-Fu'a, have not respected the clauses of the agreement, which said that injured have to be evacuated and the aid has to enter to these areas.
Well, aid agencies around the world have been struggling to adequately help Syrians affected by the war. The World Food Programme says it would need to raise $25 million every week to provide Syrian civilians with their basic food needs. Last year, it had to cut aid to 500,000 people because it didn't have enough cash. The Red Cross says it's been able to provide 9 out of 10 Syrians with clean water, but that 4 out of 5 Syrians are still living in poverty. And the UN asked the international community to help raise about $8 billion for humanitarian aid last year, but they raised actually less than half of that. It's a bit disappointing when you listen to those sorts of numbers, Sebastian. In your experience, are the pictures of hardship that we're seeing now making a difference? Are they generating an increase in support, either from governments or for the public?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. And if we look at what we do, we can definitely confirm this. People are touched by the pictures they see. They've also been touched by this tragedy before the pictures. But I think what makes us optimistic is that they do want to help. And that is where we come in with the Share the Meal app. We want to provide these people with an option to help as easy as they can. And in our case, that is this smartphone app. You can download it on the Google Play Store, on the Apple App Store. And then once you've done so, there's this button. And if you press that button, you can share your meal, as we call it, with a child that has nothing to eat. In our case, children in refugee camps, Syrian children in refugee camps in the north of Jordan. And when you press that button, it's supposed to be super easy. It's one tap. You transfer $50 to the United Nations World Food Programme, and with these $50, they can feed a child for a full day. And in the app, we show you where the children are. We see people. We've started this a couple of weeks ago, and the uptake that we see from people across the world actually has been fantastic.
Well, what can people do, though, to help those who are suffering inside Syria? That's a much bigger challenge, Sebastian.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that question.
I'm saying, what can people do to help those who are suffering inside Syria, though? That's a much bigger challenge, isn't it, Sebastian?
Well, it's for certain a tremendous challenge, but I think at the same time we need to recognize that there are people outside of Syria as well. To give you some figures, the United Nations World Food Programme is providing assistance to about 4 million people inside of Syria and about 1 to 2 million, I acknowledge it's less, but still it's 1 to 2 million people outside of Syria that have fled from Syria. What they can do is for example, if they feel that food security is important and if they've been touched by these pictures, then they can, for example, if we're talking about funding, please go to WFP.org, the website from the United Nations World Food Programme, and do give a little. It really doesn't cost much. For most of us, it's hardly a lot of money, but in that situation in Syria, also outside of Syria, it makes a huge difference. It's depending on the intervention that we talk about, it can be very little. It's about the regional average is $50 what it costs to feed one child for one day.
Are you surprised that we haven't seen countries intervene unilaterally with aid drops, for example, in the same manner that we saw not too long ago and not too far away from Syria when Yazidis, as I'm sure you will recall, were going hungry on Sinjar mountains, and there were aid drops being made by the US. Why have we not seen Arab countries or Western countries do that sort of level of intervention for these starving towns and villages in Syria?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, which unfortunately I can't answer. What I could say is that instead of doing these drops, we have two very strong resolutions that should be implemented. And yet nobody is complying with the demands of the UN Security Council.
But in light of that, would you advocate that countries, as you said, the political system, it seems, in the UN is blocked in the Security Council. Yeah. Are you calling for countries then to at least try and do what they can in terms of aid drops? Is that not something you're thinking of?
No, we haven't called for that, I mean, we haven't made that call. The only calls that we've made so far are to the government and to the UN Security Council, armed groups, and the international community, which is basically, like I said, just like complying with the resolution 2139 and 2165. Making sure, I mean, we have resolutions, we have demands. If nobody wants to answer the Security Council, I mean, that's a tragedy by itself as well. I mean, the ICRC and other local organizations can get aid, and when they already have aid to provide, but yet the government and armed groups are preventing this aid from reaching the civilians that are in need of it.
All right, Pavel, as you're, hoping and planning to get aid in soon, what sort of, are you trying to plan to help children, to get aid in which would help children resume their education? Is that something that's feasible, or is it only now simply about preventing more civilians dying from starvation, and that's as far as you can look ahead?
Look, in the country like Syria, in the areas, in the besieged areas such as Madamiyeh and Kefraya, the priority is to saving people's life. That's an utmost priority, and meeting the urgent and immediate needs of those peoples is what we try to focus on right now. The point is very, very valid. Those people, once they are provided with essential life-saving aid, will need to recover. The children will need to continue or resume their education. But also the water infrastructure will need to be repaired. The electricity line will have to be keep working again. I mean, the development work in Syria that has basically has been thrown back for like 40 years, comparing to what the country was before the conflict, is just shocking. So, but for now, our priority, our focus remains to save people's life and to bring as much as possible life-saving aid to those places.
Sebastian, I understand, although your organization works primarily with Syrians who are living in refugee camps outside of Syria, your next step is to try and take aid inside Syria. How, given all of these sieges and blockades?
Yeah, this is correct. We've been extremely fortunate to be able to reach all of these 20,000 children in the refugee camps in the north of Jordan since we launched globally, which was approximately, it was on the 12th of November, so approximately 7 weeks ago. And we are now actively working on the next campaign or the next group of beneficiaries that we want to support through the Share the Meal app. And as you rightly point out, it will very likely be inside of Syria. And I think what we need to recognize is that we're talking about these towns and the people that we cannot reach at the moment, which we have to support, and that is a very urgent thing to do. At the same time, there are 4 million people at the moment that the United Nations World Food Programme is assisting within Syria, and of these 4 million people, we will be supporting a segment of those, and they may be in the towns that we've been talking about, but they may be also somewhere else.
All right, a lot of people living under siege say, though, the longer it takes, the more lives it costs. Now, earlier I spoke to Abu Khalil, who lives in Buqin, that's in Madaya administration.
We've been under siege for more than 6 months. Nothing has been allowed in during that time. People are hungry. So far, 30 people have died because of hunger, and it's increasing day by day.
Give us an idea of the daily toll. When you say it's increasing daily, how many people are dying daily?
It's come in stages. People have been losing consciousness, one at a time, then each day it becomes more and more. 5 or 6 people have died in the last week.
You say you haven't had supplies for 6 months. What are people eating then?
There is one United Nations food truck which got access in the last 3 months approximately. This food is enough for one family for up to 10 days, but if the family is big, then it's not enough. We are desperate to eat anything, even leaves off the trees and insects.
If you don't mind me getting a little personal here, when's the last time you had a normal meal?
That was 6 months ago.
Are you hopeful now that the news is the regime will allow supplies into some of the besieged areas?
Each week we've heard about it. Each week we hear aid will come, but nothing is seen. If I don't see the UN truck and if I don't have my food basket in my hand, I'm not going to believe it. Honestly, I've lost hope.
Who stops you from collecting aid? I mean, do you see who is besieging your town, your village, and do you know them?
We're under siege from Syrian forces and their allies like Hezbollah.
But do you have any communication with these people? Does anyone in your village talk to them? I'm curious to know what sort of contact you may have with people who you say are starving you to death.
There is no contact with the people in charge of the siege.
What would you say to people in the outside world who are perhaps listening to this interview?
I have just one message. I just want to remind people that we are here, that we are human. If people don't care about us, I just want to tell them to get animal rights groups to care about us. Honestly, we are starving and eating cats and dogs.
What do you want the outside world to do?
I want them to feel our pain. There are children hungry, crying all day, asking for food, even just one leaf. The children don't have any strength. They can't stand up from their beds because they're so hungry. They're saying, I want to eat, but the answer is the same. There is no food.
A very sad account. You hear from people, of course, trapped inside Syria. If there is any good news in that sort of situation, Diana, it does seem that the media attention paid at least to Madaya and Fuan Kafraya, that they're generating some movement, I think we could say cautiously. Is there a lesson to be learnt here? And you've said it very clearly that politics seems to have failed this situation. Can public pressure and media attention be used for other areas and for other issues, maybe to stop the barrel bombings, for example?
Yes. I mean, I agree that the media played a very important role in the case of Madaya. But I mean, our concern is basically the same media attention was given to Eastern Ghouta at the beginning of the siege, and then the media, we saw like a media fatigue, and Eastern Ghouta was out of the media, and people inside of Eastern Ghouta felt that they've been forgotten. And as we see until today, the siege continues. So our concern is that the same thing might happen to Madaya. That's why we need to continue the pressure, and we need to continue pressuring the government and its allies to provide unimpeded humanitarian access and lift the sieges before it's too late.
All right, let's end the discussion at this point. Let's thank our guests, Pavel, Diana and Sebastian. And thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programme page of our website, aljazeera.com. You can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me and from all the team here, for now, it's goodbye.